Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train episode 220. And I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. Of course, this footage was taken from Under Construction, the video that comes out together with this one. And if you want to see it in real time with commentary as to what's going on, watch that. This is an episode of the Zombie Train where I'll be talking about my exploits during World War Z with the locomotive 3254 and its many passengers and its crew and the train that we carried around during the course of several years. And then the ensuing Zombie Train Incorporated. Just wanted to get that off the table. I don't know why I had to cover that again, but for those of you just joining us. Anyways, this was a question given to me by Mr. Railroad Runner. And it's actually a very, very good question. It's something that I can actually dig into as opposed to these questions on individual locomotives, where I did not have a hand in too many of these locomotives. I was largely concerned in my own, and then the company, or when Incorporated kicked, we started gaining locomotives. They got very big very quickly, and I wasn't able to get a handle and see everything. So that's why this question is kind of pertinent. It's what operating regulation did the Zombie Train have? Also, did the Zombie Train ever contend with boiler failure, negligence, or water below the crown sheet? Now, because it says Zombie Train Incorporated, because it says Zombie Train and not Zombie Train Incorporated, I'm not going to worry about too much of the top-down stuff that went on during ZT Inc. But needless to say that despite managing to avoid all but a very small handful of major failures, like we didn't have any fatal boiler explosions, which was good, but we did have quite a lot of problems that, due to rather excessive maintenance needs is what I'm trying to say. Problems that cause excessive maintenance, which were caused by engineers being not properly trained or not trained well enough, that we're just trying to follow the codes that had been set out for them, especially if people got traded around from engine to engine, they didn't have time to acclimate with a specific one, blah, 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 blah. But I'll set that aside for now. So, the operating regulation of the Zombie Train when I was in command and when we were on our own was, all things considered, fairly loose. But there was definitely a routine built into it, which was, I wouldn't operate, and I was the only one trained to operate, although there were members of the crew which were trying to learn, notably my fireman. It turned out that my cousin John, who was the head of shoveling, I guess, not the fireman, but his job was to get coal from the hoppers back into the tender, and he was the one that sort of persevered through a lot of crap and eventually got assisted by a mechanism which I have talked about before. But he ended up knowing much better than my fireman Emilio did. But even though there were two other people on crew theoretically at that point that could, try their hand at operating the locomotive, I was the only one that was officially qualified to do it. And I mean officially within the scope of the train. Because I in no way was officially qualified to run a locomotive when the Zombie Train started. I had what little knowledge I had picked up from simulators and books and whatever, which, as we know, sometimes is not the most reliable of sources. But, thank goodness for me that 3254 was a forgiving engine when it came to, and the tracks ahead of us were not too terrible either. By the time we got into anything that was going to give me trouble, I had sort of figured my way around the engine. Now, the first run was probably the most dangerous due to that novice ability of mine and nobody else on crew knowing any better. So we did manage to make it through that without blowing anything up, running anything off the track, crashing into anything, stuff like that. And that sort of set that, okay, this is something that we can do. It's something that we can manage. So it was Get up in the morning, the fire, usually was banked. If we had to drop the fire, that usually meant we were staying in a place for more than a single night. But it was get up, dawn-ish, and go out there under that light, put oil and grease on all the joints that needed it, if we had some, which generally we did. Most of the time we did. And if we didn't, it was generally, we're not going anywhere until we find some, if we were in a position where we could go looking, because running it without it would have been, a problem, even though we did have to bite the bullet sometimes when we were in the middle of nowhere. And, then get up, work the fire up. I would get up, Emilio would get up, he'd work the fire up while I was tending to the engine. Some of the other guys would work out our route. That would be handed off to Ian. He'd be our navigator. He'd come up with the cab as well with some maps, some charts, stuff like that. The diner would start up at around this point in time, although they didn't have full power because we weren't moving. We did rely off a dynamo that ran off one of the axles. So they didn't have full power, but they did what they could in the morning, and the people that were up and at 'em had breakfast at that time. Generally, I was already in the cab, though. I would have snagged something while I was heading up there. Oftentimes, I didn't really have too much of a breakfast. And then, once that got sorted out, once we got the navigator up there and built up enough steam, we'd start moving. I'd run an announcement first, tell everyone we're moving, make sure, get a head count, everybody's on the train. And check our fuel and water stores. At the end of the night, that's generally when we worry about, okay, are we in a place with water? We try to find somewhere that we can run a pump with the remaining steam from the engine and fill up our tank car and tender. And as for coal, we'd get what we could. I've talked about that at length before. I've talked about both of those things as a matter of fact. So, I've talked about the time where the pipe had gotten clogged and I figured we were okay on water, suddenly realized the injector wasn't doing anything, and then figured that out. That was an emergency scenario, but it didn't get too bad because I happened to get lucky and notice it quickly. There was another time where we had what would have been, or what could have been, a disaster, which is we were coming back from it must have been sort of northwestern Pennsylvania. You're running along the water level route after you head out of Erie, and generally you're near a water source, but either it had slipped my mind or there may have been a drought, but we had just gotten away from the Great Lakes, so it couldn't have been. But I recall, full well knowing, or realizing along the journey that we were really low on water, had, checked, confirmed that we are really low on water, we're going to have a problem here, and then making it, basically nowhere. We were stuck on this route, which is something that we had traversed before, and it was at this point where I realized, okay, well now the injector is not doing anything again. I know that I'm about to run out of water here, and just about our only option was, throw the brakes on and drop the fire when we could, and that's what we did, and then we had to deal with that because we had fire on the tracks, because you just dropped it in the middle of nowhere. You're not supposed to do that, obviously. And then tote water. Now that could have been a disaster, but that was, it was something that was again recognized ahead of time and then verified. It was some sort of, it was negligence on my part, certainly, that contributed to the fact that we did not have water running to that. We did not have sufficient water running into that stretch. I don't remember when that was, but it must have been before we went west. Because coming back, we didn't have that sort of problem, and it didn't really go over there. Yeah, that must have been fairly early on, really. Maybe before we got into the rhythm of the whole thing. But, we did have to contend with that on occasion from even myself. The other train crew would generally supplement if I tended to miss something, but the thing that I learned obviously, and this is not just advice for running a zombie train, is, once you develop a routine, you can stick to it much more easily. When you do something out of habit, it makes it, you're more likely to do it again and again and again without having to think about it too much. And so then it was run until sunset. If we wanted to push it, we'd run further than that. We'd stop maybe once or twice during the day, or if we saw something that, in particular that we needed to pay attention to, or, we thought was worth our attention, because, you get all sorts of things. During World War Z, there was plenty to distract you, and that was a problem, because you don't want to get distracted when you're dealing with that. So, it was a lot of, well, we're going too fast to stop. Or, there's something out ahead of us, and that's when we're going to apply the brakes, see if we can get to a stop in some vicinity of what's, whatever's broadcasting or whatever is, you'd see plumes of smoke, you'd wonder what's burning, stuff like that, because it generally indicated a human presence, especially the broadcasting bit, not like zombies are going to be running a radio station. And we did a lot of contact with locals at that point. Just tried to help out however we can, and then we'd generally make trades however we could, because we were trying to get along on our own as well. It's, as you might presume, fairly difficult, especially with a train of 30-something people. So, as well, and that is not the end of our maintenance nightmares. That's sort of the water-related issues we had, but we did have plenty of maintenance problems. Now, if there's something that people that work around steam engines, especially doing the maintenance, can tell you, is you don't try to weld. You don't try to use a weld as a fix for, a crack or a leak or something like that. You generally, if you're going to weld, you generally will put a patch on. If there's something that's, if there's something that, say the firebox sheets are too thin or the boiler's too thin, well, generally at that point you don't bother with that. You just get a new boiler if you can. But we didn't really have the luxury of that stuff. But where welding comes into it is we were heading through. We were heading sort of meandering from Tennessee-ish through, into Georgia towards Atlanta. This was before we got to Atlanta that time, which I haven't really talked about. That should come out in a book at some point, someday. I don't know. And we had a perpetual leak that had developed, and not like leaks go away on their own, but a leak that had developed in the cylinder on the engineer's side, at the cylinder head on the front of the engine. And the issue was, well, we don't have time to stop and do a major rebuild. We don't have the ability to manufacture a new part right now. So, we'll shore it up, weld it, and then fix it as soon as we can. Well, we got to Atlanta, didn't exactly find the cheery greeting we had hoped for. Got kind of run out of town. And the next time we even thought about it, we were running away from a hurricane, and the cylinder head blew clean off, and then rammed into the caboose of Beta Rail, which was directly in front of us. Not my finest moment, at any rate. That was, you see a lot of the individual maintenance problems that the zombie train had, while it was just the zombie train, obviously, or rather, would typically develop from situations where, oh, we need a quick fix for this problem because we have to get to do, X, Y, and Z. These things that we have to get to, we can't sit around here and work on new parts or whatever. And while we would do a lot of working on the fly, it was, oh, well, we'll just throw in a temporary solution and we'll get to it when there's time. And oftentimes that time came because whatever the temporary solution was broke badly. Yeah, and that's just one example. I could probably reference some others, but we're running low on time here. I hope I've done at least a decent job of answering the question. If you want more specifics, more detail, feel free to ask more. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Train Man out.